Hello. Hello. Haha. They smiled when you stayed quiet. They celebrated when you stayed patient. They mistook your silence for weakness and your kindness for surrender. But now the mask is off. The version of you they created with betrayal, disrespect, and pressure has finally stepped into the light. This is not Rashada's awakening, not revenge, but transformation. Sometimes the world pushes a soul so far into darkness that it accidentally creates something unstoppable. And when that side wakes up, people panic because they realize too late they were never dealing with someone ordinary. They were provoking a storm. For a long time, people watched you stay quiet and wrote their own story about what that silence meant. They thought because you didn't react, you didn't notice. Because you didn't argue, you had no comeback. Because you walked away instead of creating chaos, you were too weak to stand your ground. That is the funny thing about silence. Most people are too uncomfortable with it to understand it. They rush to fill empty space with assumptions, and almost all of them are wrong. Silence is often mistaken for surrender by those who only understand noise. In a world where everyone is desperate to be seen, heard, and validated, a quiet person becomes a mystery, and people fear what they cannot read. So instead of trying to understand you, they simplify you. They label you as harmless, passive, soft, or easy to manipulate. It helps them feel safe. It makes them believe they have already figured you out. But what they never realize is that silence can be discipline. It can be observation. It can be restraint so powerful that weaker minds confuse it for absence of strength. Not every battle deserves a reaction. Not every insult deserves a reply. Not every provocation deserves your energy. Sometimes staying silent is the loudest statement a person can make because it says, "You are not important enough to disturb my peace." Still, people rarely respect what they do not understand. They test quiet people the most. They poke, push, disrespect boundaries, and cross lines they would never dare cross with louder personalities. Why? Because they think silence means there will be no consequences. They believe patience is permission. They mistake calmness for fragility. That is where they make their biggest mistake. A silent person is often collecting data while everyone else is performing. They notice patterns. They remember words, tone changes, betrayals, inconsistencies, and hidden intentions. While others are busy underestimating them, they are learning exactly who everyone is. They see masks slipping. They watch how people behave when they think there will be no accountability. And then one day, the silence changes. Not because the quiet person suddenly became someone new, but because their tolerance reached its limit. Every human being has a threshold. Every patient soul has a final straw. There comes a moment when enough disrespect accumulates, enough lines are crossed, and enough assumptions are made. In that moment, the version of you people took for granted disappears. This is the moment that shocks everyone. The same people who once laughed at your silence suddenly become uncomfortable with your certainty. The person they thought they understood no longer seeks explanation, permission, or approval. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending your intentions to people committed to misunderstanding. You stop shrinking to make others feel powerful. And that shift feels terrifying to those who benefited from your restraint. They preferred the version of you that stayed quiet while being overlooked. They were comfortable when your kindness was accessible. Your patience was endless and your standards were flexible. But growth changes the rules. Awareness changes the game. Now your silence carries a different energy. It is no longer the silence of hesitation. It is the silence of clarity, The silence of someone who has seen enough, learned enough, and no longer needs to prove anything. There is a confidence in that kind of silence that unsettles people. It forces them to question whether they ever really knew you at all. And the truth is, they didn't. They only knew the version of you that was still learning boundaries. The version still giving chances. Still hoping people would naturally do better. Still believing understanding could solve everything. But silence teaches hard lessons. It teaches you who respects you without needing reminders. It teaches you who mistakes access for entitlement. It teaches you who only values your presence when they believe they can control your reactions. So, let them think what they want. Let them replay old versions of you in their minds. Let them remain attached to an outdated perception. Because by the time they realize your silence was never weakness, it is usually too late. You are no longer interested in correcting the assumptions. Norts. You are too focused on becoming someone their opinions can no longer reach. And that is the power they never saw coming. The quiet person was never powerless. They were simply choosing when their energy was worth using. Pain has a strange way of changing people. Not in the dramatic way movies often show, but slowly, quietly, and with brutal precision. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers. Disappointment after disappointment, betrayal after betrayal, loss after loss. At first you try to remain the same. You tell yourself this is temporary. You convince yourself that one bad experience should not harden your heart or alter your nature. You keep showing kindness, patience, and understanding, hoping the world will eventually return that same energy. But pain is a relentless teacher. It forces lessons onto people who never asked for them. It teaches you what trust costs. It shows you how quickly loyalty can disappear when convenience changes. It reveals how some people only love the version of you that is easy to manage, predictable, forgiving, and endlessly available. The moment you begin changing, they grow uncomfortable. Because pain does not just wound, it transforms. Every betrayal sharpens your awareness. Every disappointment lowers your tolerance for nonsense. Every time you are pushed beyond your limits, something inside you recalibrates. The version of you that once gave endless chances begins to question why access was handed out so freely. The part of you that tolerated disrespect in the name of peace starts realizing peace built on self-abandonment is not peace at all. That is when the shift begins. It is subtle at first. You start saying less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer feel the need to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You observe more carefully. You become harder to impress and even harder to manipulate. Your standards quietly rise. Your boundaries become less negotiable. And suddenly people notice something is different. They feel it before they understand it. The energy they once relied on is no longer available to them. The emotional access they took for granted has limits now. The version of you they once controlled through guilt, pressure, or expectation is fading. This confuses them. People become deeply uncomfortable when pain creates a stronger version of someone they once underestimated. They were prepared for your sadness, your frustration, even your anger. What they were not prepared for was your evolution. Because pain often creates discipline, it teaches emotional economy. You stop wasting time convincing people to value what they should have valued naturally. You stop chasing closure from those incapable of giving it. You stop offering loyalty where there is no reciprocity. There is a certain clarity that pain gives you, a ruthless understanding of what deserves your energy and what does not. This is the part many people misunderstand. They assume pain automatically destroys people. Sometimes it does break parts of you. It strips illusions, it kills naive, it forces innocence to mature. But destruction is not always the end of something. Sometimes it is preparation. Pain burns away versions of you that were never built for survival. The overly trusting version, the approval-seeking version, the version terrified of disappointing others, the version willing to betray itself for acceptance. Those versions do not survive intense pain for long. In their place, something else is built. A person who can sit alone without panic. A person who no longer fears disappointing those who misunderstand boundaries as rejection. A person who can walk away from what drains them, even if it once mattered deeply. Pain teaches detachment in ways comfort never could. And that new version is difficult to control, not because it has become cruel, but because it has become aware. Aware of manipulation disguised as concern. Aware of conditional support disguised as love. Aware of people who only show appreciation when they sense distance. Awareness is dangerous to anyone who benefited from your lack of it. That is why your growth may trigger resistance. People often mourn the loss of the version of you they had easier access to. They call you distant, cold, or changed. And in a way, they are right. You did change. Pain changed you, but not into something broken, into something informed, something more selective, more intentional, more self-respecting. There is power in becoming unfamiliar to those who once thought they had you figured out, because the truth is, pain did not create weakness in you. It created precision. It forced you to examine what truly matters and what was merely tolerated out of habit, hope, or fear. Now your presence is different. Your standards are different. Your responses are different. And people who once believed they could predict you no longer know what version of you they are dealing with. That uncertainty unsettles them because pain created someone they cannot control anymore. Not through guilt, not through neglect, not through emotional games, and not through old expectations. You learn too much to go backwards. People are comfortable with your softness for as long as it benefits them. They celebrate your kindness when it makes you easier to access, easier to influence, and easier to take for granted. They admire your patience until it no longer serves their convenience. But the moment you become harder to reach, more guarded, or less willing to tolerate disrespect, their language changes. Suddenly, you are different. Suddenly, you are cold. Suddenly, the same people who once ignored your limits are shocked that you finally created what they call your dark side, is often nothing more than self-preservation. Not every hardened version of a person is born from cruelty. Sometimes it is built from experience. It is the result of learning. You certain lessons too many times. You trusted, and trust was mishandled. You gave loyalty, and loyalty was met with convenience. You offered understanding, and people interpreted that as unlimited access. After enough repetition, something changes. You begin noticing patterns you once ignored. The emotional exhaustion starts outweighing the hope that people will eventually change. You become less interested in seeing the best in everyone and more interested in seeing what is actually there. Reality replaces illusion. That shift can feel uncomfortable even to you because no one enjoys losing parts of themselves they once valued. No one wants to feel less open, less naive, less trusting. But survival is rarely about preserving comfort. It is about adaptation. When an environment repeatedly punishes softness, softness learns to wear armor. This is where people get confused. They assume every protective behavior is evidence of bitterness. They believe boundaries are hostility. They interpret emotional distance as arrogance. But what they fail to understand is that some versions of you were created by necessity, not preference. You did not become more selective because it was trendy. You became selective because being endlessly available was draining you. You did not become quieter because you lost depth. You became quieter because not everyone deserves access to your thoughts. You did not become emotionally guarded because you enjoy isolation. You became guarded because, experience taught you the cost of careless vulnerability. That is not evil. That is pattern recognition. Survival often looks harsh to those who never had to develop it. People who benefited from your unguarded nature are often the first to resent your evolution. They preferred the version of you that could be reached with minimal effort. The version that over-explained, overgave, overforgave, and overextended itself to maintain harmony. But eventually, something inside you realizes harmony. Without self-respect is just quiet suffering. And once that realization hits, your priorities change. You stop confusing being needed with being valued. You stop mistaking attention for genuine care. You stop sacrificing inner stability to preserve external relationships that were never balanced to begin with. There is a certain strength in becoming less emotionally negotiable. You no longer bend yourself into familiar shapes just to remain digestible. You become more comfortable disappointing people who only liked the version of you that lacked boundaries. You begin understanding that being liked and being respected are not the same thing. And often the moment you start choosing respect, people accuse you of changing for the worse. But growth rarely looks pleasant to those attached to your old limitations. Your so-called dark side is often just the side of you that learned to say no without guilt. The side that stopped romanticizing potential and started responding to reality. The side that understands access should be earned, not assumed. It is not about becoming heartless. It is about becoming intentional. There is still kindness in you, but now it is protected. There is still empathy, but it is no longer reckless. There is still loyalty, but it is no longer handed out like a free resource. That clears throat difference matters because survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. It is choosing silence over unnecessary conflict, distance over repeated disappointment, discernment over blind trust. It is becoming the kind of person who no longer ignores internal alarms for the sake of comfort or familiarity. And yes, that version of you may seem darker to those who only knew your softness. But darkness is not always destruction. Sometimes it is depth. Sometimes it is wisdom developed in difficult conditions. Sometimes it is the part of you that learned how to survive spaces that were never built to protect your peace. So let people misunderstand it if you want. Not everyone will appreciate the version of you that finally learned self-preservation. Some will miss the easier version. Some will resent your limits. That is fine. They are mourning access, not your downfall. And survival was never meant to be convenient for the people who benefited from your lack of it. For a long time, people knew only the version of you that was edited for their comfort. A softer version, a filtered version. The one that smiled through frustration, tolerated more than necessary, and stayed measured even when disrespected. Not because that was all you were, but because not every environment felt safe enough to reveal your full nature. Sometimes people mistake adaptation for identity. You learned early that certain parts of yourself were easier to hide. The intensity, the ambition, the standards, the refusal to be controlled. Those qualities often made people uncomfortable. So you adjusted, you lowered your volume, softened your edges, and became easier to digest. Not fake, but selective. You gave people only what felt manageable. And over time, they got used to that version. That is where the illusion began. People often become attached to the version of you they find most convenient, the version that does not challenge them too much, the version that stays agreeable, accessible, and emotionally predictable. They build an identity for you in their minds, then start believing that identity is permanent. But masks are not lies. Sometimes they are survival tools. A mask can be professionalism in chaotic environments. It can be patience in rooms where emotional expression is weaponized. It can be politeness around people who have not earned intimacy. It can be restraint while you are still learning which battles deserve your energy. The problem is, people forget there is always more underneath. They assume the version they met is the final version. They think what is visible is all that exists. They become comfortable with your predictability until something shifts. Sometimes it is betrayal, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes growth, sometimes a simple moment of clarity where you realize you are tired of shrinking yourself to remain understandable. And in that moment, the mask begins to fall. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gradually. You stop laughing at things that disrespect you. You stop pretending not to notice patterns. You stop over-accommodating people who confuse your flexibility with weakness. You become more direct, more selective, less willing to perform emotional labor for those who offer little in return. At first, people think it is temporary. They assume you are just in a mood, going through a phase, or becoming difficult for no reason. But when the shift continues, discomfort sets in, because now they are meeting a version of you they never accounted for. A version with sharper boundaries, a version less interested in approval, a version willing to disappoint others in order to stay aligned with itself. And suddenly they say, you have changed. Of course you changed. Growth always looks like change to people invested in your old form. What they are really reacting to is not your transformation, but their loss of familiarity. They no longer know how to predict your responses. The buttons that once worked no longer produce the same results. Old dynamics stop functioning. That uncertainty unsettles people, especially those who benefited from your mask. They preferred the version of you that explained everything, forgave quickly, tolerated imbalance, and stayed emotionally available regardless of how little was reciprocated. The mask made you easier to manage, but once it falls, people are forced to confront something uncomfortable. They never fully knew you. They only knew the version of you that was being considerate of their limitations. The real you may be quieter than expected, but far more observant, less reactive, but more decisive, less emotionally available, but more internally solid, stronger than the image they created. And strength often surprises people who only saw your restraint. There is a unique power in no longer editing yourself for mass consumption. You stop asking whether your authenticity is too much. You stop minimizing your standards to avoid intimidating fragile egos. You stop apologizing for outgrowing environments that only welcome smaller versions of you. That freedom changes your energy. You become more grounded, more self-defined, less influenced by external interpretation. And ironically, the people most shocked by the real you are often the ones who gave you the clearest reason to stop pretending, because nothing reveals identity faster than pressure. Pressure strips away unnecessary performance. It forces truth to the surface. It shows you what parts of yourself were genuine and what parts were merely adaptive. So when the mask falls, it is not the creation of someone new. It is the exposure of what was always there. The discipline, the edge, the standards, the depth, the self-respect, the boundaries. Now they see it clearly. Not because you became different overnight, but because you finally stopped hiding pieces of yourself to make others comfortable. And for some people, that is the most unsettling reveal of all. They did not lose the old you. They just never had full access to the real one. For most of life, people are trained to chase approval without even realizing it. It starts early. You are rewarded for being agreeable, praised for fitting expectations, and accepted when your behavior aligns with what others find comfortable. Slowly, a pattern forms. You begin measuring yourself through reactions. Validation becomes feedback. Feedback becomes identity, and identity becomes something built on external permission. This is how many people lose themselves, not all at once, but in small negotiations. A filtered opinion here, a swallowed emotion there, a decision postponed because someone else might disapprove. Snorts, controversial, less threatening. And over time, you begin mistaking approval for safety. Approval feels secure because it reduces friction. When people like you support you or agree with your choices, there is less resistance, less confrontation, less uncertainty. But approval is a fragile foundation. If your confidence depends on how others respond, then your direction can always be manipulated. That is the hidden cost. People who require approval are easier to influence, easier to guilt, easier to pressure. Their boundaries are often negotiable because rejection feels more painful than self-betrayal. They tolerate situations that drain them simply because they fear being misunderstood, disliked, or excluded. Approval dependency is not always obvious. Sometimes it looks like over-explaining. Sometimes it is people-pleasing disguised as kindness. Sometimes it is perfectionism built on fear of criticism. Sometimes it is staying loyal to relationships, environments, or expectations long after they have expired. But eventually something changes. There comes a point where the exhaustion outweighs the reward. You realize how much of your energy has been spent managing perception rather than building substance. You notice how often your decisions have been edited through the lens of what will they think. That question begins losing its power. Not because you stop caring about people entirely, but clears throat. Because you start caring more about internal alignment than external applause. You understand that approval is inconsistent, conditional, and often tied to convenience. The same people praising you today may criticize you tomorrow the moment your choices stop benefiting them. That realization is liberating. It forces you to separate your worth from reaction. You stop performing versions of yourself designed for mass acceptance. You stop asking for permission to become who you were already becoming. You make decisions based on clarity instead of consensus. And that is where your power changes, because a person who no longer needs approval becomes harder to control. Guilt loses effectiveness. Manipulation weakens. Social pressure becomes less intimidating. Emotional blackmail no longer lands the same way. Why? Because your decisions are no longer outsourced. You are not constantly scanning the room for signs of acceptance before trusting your own instincts. You are not shaping your life around maintaining favorable opinions. That independence can feel threatening to others, especially those who relied on your desire to be liked. They were comfortable when your behavior was negotiable, when a little disappointment could redirect your choices, when silence, withdrawal, or judgment could make you second-guess yourself. But once approval is no longer your currency, those old mechanisms stop working. This is often when people accuse you of becoming selfish, distant, arrogant, or difficult. Not always because you changed negatively, but because you became less accessible to influence. Boundaries feel offensive to people who benefited from your flexibility. Self-trust looks rebellious in environments built on conformity. Certainty is intimidating when others are accustomed to your hesitation. There is something deeply unsettling about a person who can stand alone in their decisions. Not recklessly, not stubbornly for the sake of ego, but with grounded conviction. A person like that becomes unpredictable to systems that depend on compliance. You are no longer easily herded by trends, opinions, or collective pressure. Praise does not inflate you too much, and criticism does not dismantle you too easily. That emotional neutrality is power. Because once your identity is no longer rented out to public opinion, your energy becomes available for more meaningful things: discipline, growth, strategy, creativity, peace. You begin building a life that reflects your values rather than your image, and that changes everything. Your relationships become more honest because they are no longer maintained through performance. Your goals become clearer because they are not diluted by comparison. Your sense of self becomes stronger because it is rooted internally. This is what many people misunderstand. Not seeking approval does not mean rejecting connection or becoming emotionally detached from humanity. It means connection is no longer purchased through self-abandonment. It means you can be respected without constantly being liked. You can be misunderstood and still remain certain. You can disappoint others without collapsing into guilt. And once you learn that, a different kind of confidence emerges. Quiet, stronger, less theatrical, more stable. The kind of confidence that does not beg to be validated. That is what makes you dangerous. Not to others in a destructive way, but to anything that once depended on your insecurity to keep you small. Because now your direction belongs to you.